I was working on a weekly newspaper in suburban Philadelphia when I saw an advertisement in the one ads for engineers to work on Project Vanguard. And after Vanguard, it said man's first step into space. They were interviewing engineers. I went down there, and when they sat me down, they said, "What kind of an engineer are you?" I said, "I'm not an engineer, I'm a writer. But this program's going to be in the public eye very, very much, and you're going to need a writer who can understand what the engineers say and translate it into language that the rest of the people can understand." Well, they fell for it. They hired me. I didn't have to tell them I would wash windows, scrub floors. I moved to Middle River, Maryland, suburb of Baltimore, and for the next 2 and a little more years, I worked on the Vanguard project. What I was doing was public relations. I was taking the engineers' reports and translating them into language that the general public would understand. It occurred to me pretty quickly that the biggest part of our audience were people in the Congress who didn't have much of an idea of what the hell was going on. I remember the man who was picked as the first chairman of the House of Representatives Space Committee in Washington. He said to me, when Mr. Speaker Rayburn asked me to be chairman of the Space Committee, I didn't even know what space was. But this is the guy who got to be the head of the committee. It was run by the Navy because the Navy had the ability to build the satellite. President Eisenhower made the decision that Vanguard would be a peaceful project. No military hardware allowed. So the Martin Company that built the launcher, the people I worked for, had to start from the ground up and build a totally new and different rocket. It was highly refined and very fragile. And the first one we tried to launch, first time we put all 3 rocket engines together, the damn thing blew up 6 feet above the launch pad. And then Vanguard got to be called Kaputnik. Well, of course, what happened was we all assumed that the American project would be the first one to succeed. The Russians announced they would try to launch a satellite, but nobody paid any attention to them. And then on October 4th, 1956, was it? They put Sputnik in orbit, and we looked pretty bad. A month later, we tried to launch a Vanguard rocket, much faster than our original schedule called for, and the result was a disaster. It wasn't at that one. There were, I believe, 6 successful launches in all. That all gets forgotten. The media and the general public doesn't even remember that. The satellite was built at the Naval Research Lab in suburban Washington, and our factory was outside of Baltimore. So we spent most of our time on the launching rocket. That was our job. And as rockets go, it was a flimsy affair. The job was to put a satellite in orbit, and the contract specified the weight of the satellite, which would be no more than 20 pounds, but it also specified the first stage rocket engine built by General Electric, if I recall correctly, was the X-204, and it had a 28,000-pound thrust maximum. The Army had a much more powerful rocket. Werner von Braun was working in Huntsville in those days. He'd given up bombing London and was talking about putting people on the moon. But von Braun worked for the Army. The Vanguard project was run by the Navy. The Navy didn't mind the Russians so much, but the Army, so they had nothing to do with von Braun and went along with General Electric's nice little engine. A strange thing happened while I was working at Vanguard. A gentleman named David Kyle came to visit, and he was a big-time science fiction fan, and he asked me if I would bring a couple of Vanguard engineers to the World Science Fiction Convention. And I said, "What's that?" I had never heard of a science fiction convention before. But David introduced me to science fiction fandom, and for that I am forever grateful. I brought a couple of engineers to the convention, which was held in New York City, and they nearly ran away when they saw some of the fans in their costumes. But I literally grabbed them by their coattails and pulled them back and got them to sit down at the first panel they were involved in. They were sitting down with Arthur Clarke, Willie Lay, several other people whom they knew and admired. So they settled down and they had a good time. The way I have always looked at it is science fiction is based on facts. That science fiction, you try to play fair with the facts as they are known. I'm 84 years old now. It's kind of pleasurable to realize you've been involved in something that will be around hundreds of years from now.